Well, thank you. Just having mild technical problems getting the slides up, but now it looks okay. What I'm going to do in this talk is look firstly at the Water Framework Directive, which is the main source of water quality for rivers legislation, and the UK implementation of that. Then consider point source pollution, where the environmental protection regulations require environmental permits for those discharging to water. Look at sewers, mainly through the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive and how that's implemented. Highway drains, which is something Philip's committee mentioned, and look and see how that works. Then come on to perhaps one of the most intractable problems, and that's pollution of nitrates from agriculture and other sources. And then finally put that together with the monitoring regime. Sorry, another technical problem. But before I do that, just bear in mind that underlying all this is a common law. And the common law does involve itself with pollution. So that a riparian owner, for example, can bring a civil action if the stream is polluted, because they have the right for a stream to come to them in its natural state in flow, quantity and quality. And a court will say, well, it has to make a material difference. So a couple of microplastics or whatever wouldn't do, but a good case could be brought. And similarly, there can be also an action by fishery interests to protect fish in their waters. But let's move to the main agenda and the Water Framework Directive. First of all, look at Brexit. Now, the Water Framework Directive is not retained EU law under the European Act. And so the directive in itself is gone. Any amendments to it by the European Commission, European Parliament, etc., won't apply in the UK. However, it's implemented by the 2017 regulations and is so EU-derived legislation, which means that courts should follow what the European Court has said, and I should only rarely depart from it. And that still gives a very good high level of protection. Although bear in mind, in the Environment Act, the requirement in the EC that environmental directives should be based on a high level of protection have gone. And so that's a considerable degradation of environmental law in my view. We'll have to see how the courts deal with that. Modifications have been made to the 2017 regulations to deal with Brexit. And for chemicals, changes to the regulations will be made by other regulations under Section 89 of the Environment Act. So we are going to see changes in the directive. Looking at the purpose of the directive, firstly, it's to prevent further deterioration of waters, protect and enhance status of aquatic ecosystems, give specific measures for reduction of priority substances, i.e., for example, like lead, and to remove priority hazardous substances like cadmium. It applies to a number of water bodies, surface waters divided into rivers, lakes, and that would include ponds, transitional waters, which are sort of the edge between tidal waters and fresh waters, coastal waters, and then also groundwater. And this is regardless of size. A small pond has exactly the same status as a lake in the Lake District. Water bodies are classified for surface water status determined by the pore of its ecological status and its chemical status. I come on to that. Good surface water status means that both the ecological and the chemical status are good. While groundwater status is determined by the poor of its quantitative and chemical status. And quantitative brings in abstraction. You mustn't abstract too much water from the groundwater area, because that will then reduce its quality. What is good ecological status? It's slightly complicated. The values for the biological quality elements for the surface water body type show low levels of distortion resulting from human activity, but deviate only slightly from those normally associated with the surface water body type under undisturbed conditions. Now, basically what that means is that human activity should have a minimal effect on the natural status of the water body concerned. And you look at that by considering its composition and the abundance of biological elements like phytoplankton, fish, and so on, as well as hydromorphological quality, like the condition of the channel, in other words, the body of the river channel and the chemical elements in it. Bearing in mind that some of those chemical elements will, of course, be natural elements. And then good chemical status, even more slightly complicated, I'm afraid, but for surface water, good chemical status means that no concentrations of priority substances, as put in the Priority Substances Directive, which we still signed up to, because that's also retained EU law. And then you have environmental quality standards, which aim to protect the most sensitive species from direct toxicity, including predators and humans via secondary poisoning. In other words, if you're swimming in the water and you get into contact with priority substances, that would be secondary poisoning. And then substances are listed in the EQS directive with an average and or maximum limit over a year, and I'll come back to that at the end when I deal with monitoring. Timetable. Just been told it's going to take decades. Unfortunately, I think the Commission got slightly over-optimistic when in 2000, because we were supposed to have good surface and groundwater status by 2015. That's obviously passed. 2017 regs extended that to December 2021, possibly to 2027. After 27, under the directive as it is for now, you shouldn't really extend it, because you can only extend it if you haven't got good status because of natural conditions like, for example, an earthquake or heavy rain or whatever has affected the water body. It just ain't going to happen. And the government is going to have to introduce some form of new timetable. And obviously, there are going to be a lot of discussions about what that new timetable should be. But as a lawyer, I would suggest it should be a realistic timetable. There's nothing worse for a lawyer than having a timetable that is not going to be achieved, because then the law doesn't look effective. But that's just my view. But anyway, there will have to be some form of new timetable. Now, the directive and the implementing regulations works on river basin catchments. There are 100 river basin catchments in England, and they're divided into 10 river basin districts for the purpose of river basin management plans. These plans aim to prevent the deterioration of the status of waters, achieving objectives and standards for protected areas, good status for all water bodies, groundwater, lakes, whatever, reversing any significant sustained upward trends in pollutant concentrations in groundwater, stopping entry of priority hazardous substances like cadmium to surface waters, and progressively reducing the pollution of groundwaters. And if we look at the programme of measures that will be undertaken under River Basin Management Plan. First, these will set out on-ground treatment, for example, improving the sewage treatment works, mechanism to ensure the actions are delivered. Look at the Water and Metal Mines program. I mean, that's run by the Coal Authority. And basically, they take a mine that's been abandoned and they put in settlement lagoons to treat the water to settle out heavy metals like cadmium coming from the mine, discharging it perhaps through a reed bed and out into the water. And that is one of the program of measures under the river basin river management plans. Then you have areas requiring special protection, water abstraction, particularly for drinking water, fisheries and shell fisheries, recreational waters. Notice recreational waters is wider than bathing waters. Nutrient sensitive areas for agriculture and the protection of species and habitats. Let's then turn to point source pollution, which is the main source of pollution, and from sewage treatment works, factories, whatever. Under the Environmental Permitting Regulations 2016, there's an offence to cause or knowingly permit a water or discharge activity or a groundwater activity, except under and to the extent authorised by an environmental permit. Now, the regulations do have exceptions to this. I'll come on to one of them in respect of highways in a minute. But this is a general rule that governs water discharges. Water discharge activity is a discharge or entry into relevant waters of any poisonous, noxious or polluting matter, waste matter or trade effluent or sewage effluent. So fairly all-encompassing. While groundwater activities, discharge of a pollutant that results in a direct input of it or might lead into a direct input of it into groundwater or any other discharge that might cause pollution. And notice we're talking about discharge. So it's discharge as again at a point source. What about then sewage treatment and sewage treatment works? This is basically done under the urban wastewater treatment regulations in England. You had the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive of 1991, which is not retained UK legislation. But the 1994 regulations are EU-derived regulations and therefore still apply and still have the effect. And the first requirement of the directive was that there must be sewage collection systems for urban areas, which take into account wastewater treatment requirements and use best technical knowledge, not entailing excessive cost, in their design, construction, and maintenance. Now, we haven't, as lawyers, looked at that aspect in maintenance, but if you consider that good maintenance of sewage collection systems is a requirement of the regulations in the directive, there may be some leeway there to consider how that is being implemented. Trade effluent. Factory produces material it wants to discharge into the sewerage system. It has to have consent from the sewerage undertaker under Section 118 of the Water Industry Act. And in compliance with the Wastewater Directive, has to be pre-treatment to protect health of sewer workers, damage to plant, and ensure discharges do not adversely affect the environment or prevent receiving waters from complying with other EU retained law, like the Water Framework Directive. Discharges, now most must have secondary treatment with limits on biological oxygen demand and chemical oxygen demand, and there may be more stringent requirements to meet other retained EU law. Eutrophication, this was the main driving force for the directive. People were concerned about algal blooms covering vast amounts of area, particularly in the Adriatic and other seas. So discharges to areas subject to eutrophication must limit total phosphorus and total nitrogen in order to prevent that. Now let's look at highway drains. Another point source discharge. but not very well regulated. You can see the problem there, as the Environmental Audit Committee found. Understanding and concern about pollution from water from road runoff was lower during much of the time. Many of the drains and outfalls have little or no measures to mitigate the risk of road runoff carrying pollutants into watercourses. And that is one of the exemptions to the environmental permitting regulations. You only need an environmental permit if you're operating a highway drain that might lead to a polluting discharge, which is pretty much all of them, and the EA or the NRW serve a notice requiring a permit for the discharge. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any of these notices, or if there are, they're very few and far between. I've certainly never come across one. And in any event, none of that covers this. I mean, here you have the road, the car coming along, producing its pollutants or whatever, flows off into the ground, and the pollutant then embeds in the ground and may be transferred some years later down to a watercourse. This is diffuse pollution, not from a discharge, point source discharge, but from a general discharge anyway. Regulated under the Water Framework Directive, Article 11, must be measures to prevent entry into waters, measures of prior authorization, and possibly registration under general binding rules, none of which will apply to our car in the rain, or at least it certainly doesn't at the moment. Mainly agricultural pollution, this is the basis for this. Nitrates in particular, manure and fertilizers, and the storage of polluting substances. Nitrates started with the Nitrates Directive, Nitrate Pollution Prevention Regulations 2015 in England, again, EU-derived legislation. Areas of the country divided into nitrate vulnerable zones. In Wales, the whole country is a nitrate vulnerable zone. Deals with, for example, the application of organic manure, requires nitrogen fertilizer plans, and has rules about the spreading of nitrogen fertilizer. Looking at agriculture as a whole, Reduction and Prevention of Agricultural Diffuse Pollution Regulations 2018, otherwise known as the Farming Rules for Water. These regulate other aspects across the whole of the country, not just in nitrate vulnerable zones. It requires a land manager, and the land manager can be someone who runs a market garden just as much as a farmer, must ensure that organic manure or manufactured fertilizer does not apply to agricultural land if the soil is waterlogged, flooded, or snow covered, or the soil has been frozen for more than 12 hours in the previous 24 hours. That's just one example of the regulations, but it gives you the flavour of them. That in this case, obviously, if the soil has been frozen for more than 12 hours and you apply organic manure to it, it'll just flow off and into a river. So the idea is to prevent that sort of thing. And also, perhaps most importantly, the land manager must ensure reasonable precautions are taken to prevent agricultural diffuse pollution resulting from land management and cultivation practices on agricultural land. For example, establishing crops early in autumn months and during dry conditions. And then storage, silage and slurry and agricultural fuel oil. These must all be stored in accordance with 2010 regulations. And there's an aspect of organic manure under the 2018 regulations. But those are dealt with, and you can see the sort of thing that's required in the photograph. We're starting to see diffuse water pollution plans. And these really are a project from the Natural England and Environment Agency that are used to plan and agree strategic action in relation to diffuse pollution at a catchment scale. Started dealing with habitats, but are likely to be extended, and they're non-statutory, but they inform regulatory action. And you can see the sort of things that measures they can produce. Water protection zones under Section 93 of the Water Resources Act, where in a protection zone that's established, you have to have consent to carry out a controlled activity, and the controlled activity must be carried out in accordance with that consent. Anti-pollution works notices, where the EA or the NRW can serve notice on the landholder to get him or her to carry out works to stop some form of prevent polluting activity. Farming rules for water and the enforcement of the farming rules for water, and cross-compliance. Basic payment scheme for farmers is, well, for your farm, you get X amount a year in the basic payment scheme. But you only get that payment if you comply with certain environmental rules, for example, establishing buffer strips between your arable area and the river. Let's finally then come on to monitoring, and how does this all put together? How do we know that it's working or not? No, not a regulation. This comes under the Water Framework Directive Standards and Classification Directions of England and Wales 2015. But you can Google it up. It's fairly easy to get hold of if you want to have a look at it. Appropriate agency, in other words, the Environment Agency or NRW, must classify the ecological status of a body of surface water, its ecological potential, if it's designated as an artificial, like a canal, or heavily modified body, the chemical status of a body of surface water, and the chemical and quantitative status of the body of water. So in other words, if you look back to the earlier things I did and the classifications there, they've got to classify all these bodies. Taking the chemical status as an example, to classify the chemical status of a body of water, they must use monitoring or modelling to estimate the concentration in the water body, all the appropriate substances as listed, and compare those concentrations with the applicable standards as listed. Monitoring requirement, essentially what this says is that as far as reasonably possible, the agencies must look at the effect on the whole of the particular water body. They can't just stick their monitoring gear into a small, rapidly flowing bit where you would expect less pollution and ignore a small eddy where you might expect more. They've got to look at the whole thing. Then standards. Categorize the water body by type. Apply physiochemical standards. Apply the environmental quality standards specified for specific pollutants. Apply the environmental quality standards specified for priority substances. And then apply the biological element status boundary values. And the biological status element boundaries are effectively the boundary between what is a good status and what is a moderate status, or a moderate status, a poor status, and so on and so on. Categorization, looking at biological and BOD and ammonia. Categorized by the height of the river, is it more or less than 80 meters? And then the chalk in it in one of 7 categories. And so you then come to standards for specific pollutants, divided into standards for fresh or salt water, dissolved concentrations in micrograms per litre, freshwater long-term, short-term, and I'll just give them a penal example, 7.746. And all these standards run through. But notice that these are for individual pollutants, which is fine, absolutely wonderful. But the real problem, according to some people I've been talking to, is that it's not the individual pollutants by themselves, it's the mixtures of them. Because natural systems don't look at individual pollutants, they're concerned about the whole effect of the pollutants in the water on them. And at the moment, we don't seem to be considering mixtures very much. And maybe it's something we should do. Now that's all I was going to say about the Water Framework Directive. However, it was suggested that I look at the other WFD briefly. The other WFD is a Waste Framework Directive. And I'll just look at two articles from that. Article 15, producer liability, civil liability. The producer of the plastic wet wipes that we've just been discussing could be held liable under Article 15 for the costs engendered by having to clean up blockages in sewers or whatever. Again, it's not something we've looked at much, but it's certainly there. And I don't know, I mean, someone might want to try it out, but certainly Article 15 does give liability for the holder of the waste and makes the producer liable for what happens to their products. So that is something. And then going back a bit, Article 8, extended producer responsibility, where the producer of products takes financial and organizational responsibility for the management of waste from the product. In particular, I'd draw attention to Article 8.2, the design of products. Design of products to produce waste, and this in a sense comes back to our plastic wet wipes. Are these products designed to prevent waste? The answer seems to be no. And Article 9 is much the same effect, the prevention of waste and looking at how we prevent waste. Because in a lot of the answer, it seems to me, to some of the problems we have in our waterways isn't so much cleaning up the waters that are being polluted, but preventing those waters from being polluted in the first place by ensuring that products don't cause environmental pollution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to both of our speakers. We've had a number of questions and comments that have come in, and I think I'll start by coming back to Philip Dunn. The first point that I would ask Philip to respond on is the one that related to utilities companies. It said that they are merely consultees in the planning process, and that there are very few powers to stop a local planning authority granting a consent, especially when the government is pressing them to release more land to housing. I wonder, Philip, if that's a point that you can come back on.
Sure. Well, I think it raises 2 points. You're absolutely right that water companies and other utility companies are statutory consultees, but there is no obligation on the planning authority to follow what their advice is. In general, they would be expected to, but they don't have to. That leads to one of our recommendations in the Environmental Audit Committee report on water quality in rivers, that we said that we should introduce 2 things. We said that the SUDS regime needs to be introduced across England. So the Sustainable Urban Drainage Scheme has been introduced under Schedule 3 in Wales. The power is there to do it in England without primary legislation, but it has not been introduced. And this allows water companies developers to continue to have the right to connect to water company assets, essentially the closest to the development. And that's one of the things that has encouraged the combination of surface and foul water into water company assets, because although the developer is now required under the SUDS legislation to separate water within the confines of the development, surface and foul, as soon as it leaves the development and goes into the water company assets, that they're no longer responsible for that. So we think this is a complete nonsense, and that one of the things we're looking for in the planning bill when this emerges is greater clarity on the responsibility for planning authorities to take account of the ability for water companies to receive for example, community infrastructure levy to be able to provide some of the funding to allow them to increase their infrastructure capacity to cope with the water coming off the development. And secondly, implementation of SUDs, which would remove the right to connect, if implementation of Schedule 3 to remove the right to connect.
Thank you, Philip. I'll pose another point for Philip before I bring John in on a question that relates to the a legal point. But can I just remind those here present that if they want to, we're getting questions coming in virtually. Of course, we have the great advantage of being able to raise a hand if you would like to and are in attendance. And there is a roving mic that will find its way to a raised hand if you have any points that occur to you for this particular session. Now, before turning to John, I'll raise one more, well, I think two more, one that's come in on the Q&A function for Philip, and one that I wanted to raise. It's 32 years, says one of our delegates, since Ofwat has been charged with making sure that there was enough investment to keep pace with population growth. And I'd ask Philip to respond to that with any consideration that is given to that point within Parliament or otherwise.
Well, thank you. That question came from Guy Linley-Adams, and it's good to see you on the screen, Guy. We have yet to meet in person too, but Guy was also very helpful in joining my campaign for my private members bill. I think that the guidance to Ofwat since privatisation has been to focus on two things primarily. One is water supply, to ensure there is good quality drinking water available across the country. And secondly, to keep bills as close to or below inflation. And those overrode any other capital investment requirements and priorities for Ofwat. And that's why there hasn't been enough funding available to water companies to invest in the underground drainage networks. There are some big issues on supply, and a comment was made in here about abstraction rates in Cambridge, I think, from another person on the chat. There's no question that one of the consequences of climate change and all the modelling that the Met Office and water companies are doing is that we're going to run into a crunch in coming decades about water supply in this country unless we invest significantly in supply infrastructure. But the point that we've been making in our committee is that that has to be done alongside significantly greater investment in the treatment side of the business, because otherwise we will continue to pollute our river systems and destroy the ecosystems that thrive for our aquatic species, and that then flows into our oceans, as John was touching on extended producer responsibilities emanating originally from the EU. We are now going to be introducing a sort of succession of measures in the UK through the deposit return schemes for drinks containers, which are due to come into force in 2024, I think now in England, 2023 in Scotland, although that seems to be subject to a bit of a wobble. And John also touched on plastic packaging and other forms of packaging. We are seeing a pretty much a headlong rush by corporates to take greater responsibility because of the environmental consequences of the packaging that they've been used to using, to start to move towards biodegradable and non-plastic based types of packaging, stimulated in part by legislation, but primarily by consumer behaviour and consumer demand. And I think this is a really important, again, sort of inflection point in the way in which we think about how we consume, what we consume, and what we throw away and how we do it.
Thank you. I will now pass on to John with a couple of questions and then come back. I see we have a hand up there. Perhaps we'll take that question after John answers these two questions, and before I've got a second hand up there. And a third, so it's all kicking off in here. So John, if we're asked, can the law be changed so that highways authorities stopped redirecting stormwater into sewage pipes? That's the first question for you. And then if you can take these together, the second is, please could John tell us what should be done about highway runoff is there a legal mechanism by which the EA can be made to apply the environmental permitting regs and serve notice on outfalls so that permit applications must be made? That would allow, says the questioner, the permit conditions to define what treatment must be installed and how the treatment device must be maintained and operated. John, I'll hand the mic over to you and then come back to the hands that I've just seen go up.
Dealing with the last question first, the only real way you're going to do that is by way of judicial review of the Environment Agency. And to make that sort of case, you would have to find a highway or outfall. You would have to show to the court's satisfaction that it was polluting waters, that it had a significant effect on the waters, possibly just simply that it prevented it from reaching good status. And then you would serve a notice on the Environment Agency saying, well, look, this is happening. Will you now serve a notice on the Highway Authority to get it to put in controls on this highway outfall? And if they say no, then you bring your judicial review. But that's the only way I can think of doing it. And it's a bit of a cumbersome process and a bit of an expensive process. But if you can prove your case, and given the Environment Agency's duties to deal with water pollution, I think you've got a reasonable chance of success on that. Then coming to, can you change the law to prevent highways authorities discharging into sewers? Yes, you can. You can change the law to anything if Parliament allows you to. Whether it would or not, I don't know. But certainly you could bring a case, present a case to MPs and say, we think the law should be changed in this respect. You probably have to say what the alternative would be. In other words, how does the Highway Authority get rid of excessive rainfalls? I mean, you saw that slide with heavy rain falling on a road. That water's got to go somewhere. But if you can do that, then yeah.
Thank you very much. Just while we revisit the hands that went up, there are two over here. I'll just add, if I may, to John's answer in relation to judicial review. We've had a number of questions that touch on abstraction, and John referred in one of his earlier slides to retained law and what happens post-Brexit. I'm currently acting for a landowner in Norfolk that has managed to get permission from Mr. Justice Chamberlain a week ago in judicially reviewing the Environment Agency for its failure to control levels of abstraction in order to protect European protected species in the Norfolk Broads. The case is one that benefits from Aarhu's cost protection. So whilst John's absolutely right that normally a judicial review would be costly, or at least risk being costly, that can be managed if Aarhu's cost caps can be obtained, as they have in the case of Harris and the Environment Agency. I name it there so that those who are interested in abstraction, the effect of abstraction on habitats, and more generally, how European legislation and case law plays out post-Brexit in this context and elsewhere, might be able to keep an eye on the High Court judgment that we expect to have in a few months. I'll move now to the two questions here. If our roving mic could make its way to those two ladies in the first two rows. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Sue Willman. I'm a solicitor and I also work at King's College Legal Clinic. I wanted to thank the speakers. I thought the presentations were fantastic, really useful. So I have a question for each speaker. First of all, for Philip Dunn. At the moment, the Council of Europe is thinking about a new human rights for healthy environment, and Liz Truss, your colleague, will be going to the meeting of the Council of Ministers in May. I wondered if you, as chair of the Audit Committee, would think that could be a useful way of increasing our protection for waterways and other environmental rights in the UK. And secondly, a question for John. I work with a small NGO called London Mining Network, and one of the concerns is about exploration for new mining, for example, tin mining in Cornwall, which may then open up old mine works, which will then have an adverse effect on waterways, groundwater, surface water, etc. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about how the regimes that you talk about work against the, permitting regulations, which are sort of supporting, encouraging, might encourage mining exploration, but then there's the risk of increased, mercury, arsenic, etc. in the local riverways. Thanks.
Thank you. So on the Council of Europe motion, I wasn't aware that they were looking at what you've suggested, establishing a human right for the environment in some respect. I know the leader of the UK delegation to the Council of Europe, who's one of the MP for Henley, John Howells, and I will ask him what that's all about. We've certainly not looked at it on our committee. And can I just, before handing the mic to John, in relation to what used mine workings and the water that's contained therein, there are two things that I'm aware of that are relevant to take advantage of such workings, perhaps a reason why they're being considered for reuse. One is to establish a source of freely available and subject to getting it out of the ground hot water for district heating systems to bring it on above ground. And secondly, in particular in Cornwall, is the use of the water to extract lithium for where there is the expectation from the two companies that are looking at doing this, that we could potentially supply a third of the UK's requirement for lithium for battery storage for the future.
Thank you. Briefly, I'd say there are two aspects to this. First of all, if somebody opens up a mine and as a result of their workings, water is discharged into contaminated water is discharged into a watercourse. First point is that the owner of the watercourse and the riparian owners would have a common law right to bring an action in nuisance to prevent the pollution and to recover damages for that. And that might be the simplest way of dealing with it. But equally, in my view, it would probably be a water discharge activity. It would be something that required an environmental permit. And therefore, there may well be a criminal offence if you do this without a permit.
Thank you. If we can now take, we're almost at time, so if we could take this question in the front row and then the question towards the back of the hall next, please.
Hello, good morning. I'll reiterate, I think it's been fantastic what you've both said and how this conference is going. My name is Dido Barclay. I've been working on the Thames for the last 20 years, and in the last 15 years, I've been involved actually in the sewage on the Thames, and I've been working with the Thames Blue-Green Economy. We actually were invited by the Environment Agency in 2003 or 4 to bring together some people to challenge the government on the sewage on the Thames. And so with Richard Buxton, we took the government to court, European court, which is why we've got a tunnel now. While we were working on the tunnel, we brought a team of independent people, engineers and all the independent, who proved with Chris Binney that we did not need to use the tunnel. Now, what is missing is we have not got an integrated water resource management, and that is the problem. We are calling rain to be called discharge from buildings and properties when rain is precious. There's no integrated water resource management in the government, which is the problem. That's the source of the problem. And what's absolutely essential, that if we have, so the question is, why are we calling rain discharge? Can people be now charged from not keeping their water within their property? The reason rain is going off the property is because it's not going into the rain is not going into the grass. This seems to be a fundamental legal problem that, that we're not dealing with. And why is rain being called? Why we're talking about discharge? Rain it's precious. It's precious. Why is it being called wastewater? It's not wastewater. So I see the whole of this coming through as not addressing the problem, which is being solved in Philadelphia and in China, where they have Sponge City. Philadelphia's managed it. Why are we not forcing the government? Otherwise, this is just one big talk shop. Unless we actually deal with the problem, this sort of talk will go on year after year until we get the integrated water management. And the point I'd like to make is Colin Green from Middlesex University wrote a paper showing that if London had an integrated water resource management, we would be saving £11 billion. So why?
John, if you can
I think I've.
It's half law, half politics. So let's have a quick answer from you, John, and then we'll move back to Philip.
Well, the primary culprit here, if there is a culprit, is building regulations. And when you build a house or whatever, it's supposed to have surface water downpipes to take the rain and channel it through. But the real problem, I suspect, is more that we have our drives and we have our carports and all the rest of it, and they're all impermeable, and the water flows off them. And if you had permeable drives and watercourses in building regulations, and there was a requirement in building regulations to enable water to flow in, then that might solve a lot of the problem.
Thank you. Just politically on this, you're raising a really fundamental point about how do we manage the water resource that falls freely, at least until it lands on the earth from the sky. And we need to find a way to do this. And there are lots of aspects to it, too many to go into here. But one is the Future Homes Standard, which is due to come in 2025. To what extent will that require new buildings to retain water that falls from the roofs for either use as grey water within the building, or potentially for I don't think it's likely to be used for drinking water other than in very remote places, but it could be. It happens in many other countries where water is scarce. And then how do we deal with, as John was touching on, making our surfaces more porous so that there is the opportunity for water to be absorbed by the ground rather than run off on hard standings. And that you look at building materials. Our committee's just been doing some work on the sustainability of the built environment, and one of the things that we're interested in is what building materials are becoming available, which allow for the same characteristics as having a hard standing, but it's actually porous for water. Just after I became an MP, I'll tell you a small anecdote. There was a professor from another university, not in London, who came to visit me in my constituency office with a box, and inside the box was a brick. And he said, "Could you give me a bowl and a jug of water?" And he held the brick over the bowl and poured a jug of water over it, and it ran straight through. The brick was made of reconditioned glass, and he was trying to find a company that'd be interested in commercializing this innovation. And I regret to say I couldn't. This was nearly 20 years ago, and I couldn't help him. And I've been trying to track down the professor ever since. If anybody knows who's on the call who he is, please get in touch with him.
Thank you for the question and for those answers. I'm going to get into trouble for eating unduly into your coffee break, but we've time for one more question from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, in a direct response to what Philip said, it is actually very possible in London. I actually collect all of my water, including drinking water, in London, so it can be done. But as a direct question, you mentioned that there's an issue over money for infrastructure due to Ofwat keeping bills low. But isn't there also an issue that we've given away, I think, tens of billions of pounds in private profits that the water companies have taken that should have been used for infrastructure? And do you agree that whilst any of the profits are being derived from criminal acts, i.e. illegal sewage discharges, that not a single penny more of profit should go to water companies whilst that situation is ongoing?
So we made some recommendations in our report about the role for boards in taking responsibility for the conduct of their environmental obligations, and in particular in relation to bonuses. We didn't get into dividends. I think what you need to recognise, the position that I put into the chat, is that there is vastly more private sector capital available to invest in infrastructure with a secure long-term interest return than there is from taxpayer funding. So if you argue that we should renationalise the water companies, what you're then saying is really what is the capacity for government to fund the level of investment required to improve provide the capital required to improve the water treatment facilities. And I mean, that's obviously a big political question. I'm firmly of the view, and the evidence is there since privatisation I put in the chat, the 10 years prior to privatisation, the average capital expenditure for the water sector was roughly £500 million a year across the sector, and the 10 years after, it was roughly £1 billion a year as a result of being in private companies where they are able to go out and tap the capital markets. I think the capital markets are vastly greater than is the capacity of government to support government guaranteed debt in this country, and that's why I think it's the right model that we use that to fund it. But we've got to give the power to be able to raise the capital necessary to do the work.
Thank you. I'm going to allow myself one last very short question, provided it results in a very short answer, because I don't want to miss the opportunity of asking Philip this question. He finished his presentation with a note of optimism about the regulatory landscape post-Brexit and the OEP, the Office of Environmental Protection. There are concerns that there will be a lesser ability to impose regulation that relates to waterways and other aspects of environmental pollution when the European Commission is not there as the watchdog and the regulator. What is the basis of your optimism in relation to that, Philip?
So our committee did pre-legislative scrutiny of the Environment Bill, in particular in relation to governance, and we made some recommendations on independence, not all of which were accepted by the government. We've got the Office of Environmental Protection Chief Chairman, Chairwoman, and Interim Chief Executive coming before our committee tomorrow. You can watch it I think it starts at 2:45 p.m. To specifically talk to her about the consultation that she's undertaking at the moment on the strategy for the OEP, the initial policy aspirations, and we're going to ask her what kind of inquiries have been put to her already in interim form. I am confident that the OEP will undertake an independent of government line when it comes to dealing with the matters that are brought to its attention. And there are lots of other examples of regulators which demonstrate independence from government. The OEP is funded by the taxpayer, so it has to have a chain of reporting, if you like, through a Secretary of State. We made one recommendation that it should have been established along the lines of the National Audit Office, which is accountable directly to Parliament. And that, as far as I'm aware, is the only regulator that is accountable directly to Parliament. The government rejected that and sought it to be accounted for and managed in the same way as every other regulator we have in this country. Other regulators have demonstrated their ability to be independent, perhaps somewhat less so within this sector in the form of Ofwat or the Environment Agency, but I think the OEP is going to be in a very different place.
Well, there you are, a very fitting sequel to today's events. Parliament TV tomorrow at 2:45. It only remains for me to thank our speakers and thank all of you for participating in what I think was a really interesting first pair of sessions. Come back in 5 minutes. I'm afraid it is only 5 minutes for the next session, Current Problems. We're starting at past, so apologies for the abbreviated break.
Great. Well, are we ready to start back just yet?
Yep.
Yep. Everyone coming back from their coffee, so that's great. Welcome back, everyone, to this second session of what has already been a really thought-provoking session, I've thought. So I'm Dr. Alexandra Collins. I'm a lecturer in environmental sustainability here at Imperial College's Centre for Environmental Policy. Really sorry that I couldn't be with you today in person. I've been quite unwell over the last few days, so I'm still having to keep my distance for a little while longer. But absolutely delighted to be here and even if it is virtually, and to be chairing today's session. And so we have a range of speakers now. To give some delve a little bit deeper into the problems that our waterways are currently facing. So we have a good amount of time at the end of the session for questions. So please hold on to those until all of the speakers have been. Each speaker has 15 minutes, so we're running slightly behind time now, so if everyone can try their best to keep to time, that'd be appreciated. And so without any further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Nick Vouvoulis, who's a professor here at Imperial College in Environmental Technology. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, so as Alex said, I work here at Imperial. I'm a professor of environmental technology. Technology, the wider sense of terms of application of science to solve problems. And I will present you some work we have done recently on the problem with CSOs, with based on the event duration monitoring that for the first year in 2019, we got almost complete data. The last 2 years has been happening. So how often, we will focus on an overview of how often and for how long storm overflows are used. Look at the reasons why they're used so frequently, and also their impacts. Let me explain that storm overflows, the term is the same. We normally refer them to storm overflows or combined sewers or storm tank overflows and so on. It's mainly discharges that take place when we have a lot of rainfall, or not the normal discharges out of wastewater treatment plants, where the wastewater is treated, right? So to understand kind of how this works is that wastewater and storm water runoff are collected in combined sewers, which is mostly what we have in England, and they are directed to wastewater treatment plants. The other option is separate sewers, and it's not, I think there could be some misunderstanding here. They don't have to be better, right? If stormwater is collected but not treated, that's also a significant source of pollution. If you have enough capacity, at least by combining the two in the same network, you can treat before you discharge, right? So there are different problems. Combined sewer overflows function as overflow valves. So this is when water is discharged, when the flow exceeds the capacity of the plant, right? And normally this is because of rainfall. The capacity of the plant is a complex issue to understand, but it's really a combination of design capacity, performance, and license controls. Okay, so we'll try and understand that a bit more. That's my breath. No, next one. Right. So how does it work? When we look at the capacity of a plant, there is a design capacity. It's mainly driven by when it was designed, when it was built, right? That capacity is related to what we call dry weather flow. Okay, dry weather flow is the flow in a sewer of anything else that is not caused by rainfall. So it's how much comes out of households, how much comes out of industry, and also a small amount that comes from infiltration in the pipes. And that's the formula, just to give how it works. So treatment works are designed based on 3 times dry weather flow, so that anytime you have more rainfall than that, you would use the overflows. So you can see here, for example, normally if you have a combined system, the capacity of the plant would cover just enough, 3 times the dry water flow, and the remaining amount will just be discharged into water courses. So in theory, they're supposed to use it regularly, not very frequently, and they're a good part of the system because at least they collect, they allow for more water to be treated before discharged. So it's a matter of capacity, really. The whole problem comes down to understanding why are we using them more frequently. Let's see at the capacity. I will explain later what is the 3 dry water flow and how this is important. Right. So what we've been seeing is the last few years in England, in the media, a lot of stories about the sewage being regularly dumped illegally into rivers. Lots of articles. One of the reasons we are here for today is the public attention on this subject. And this is really an issue. Although CSOs should only be used in exceptional circumstances, they have been used in England far more frequently. So let's see at that data. Let's try and understand why this happens. First of all, it is not just a problem for England. This is a problem with most of the Western world with aging infrastructure. Okay, so you can see, for example, the same thing happens in New York, the same thing happens in Europe, the same happens in Ireland, especially in all those sewer networks that are old, and the capacity has changed. They were designed for different population equivalent, and now the demand is much higher, much more water is produced. Therefore, the capacity has shrunk in terms of how much rainfall can absorb. So, for example, if you see at Europe, the situation is similar. For example, 4% of EU surface waters are failing to reach good ecological status. We've heard about earlier because of CSOs. In the US, 3.9 billion cubic meters of untreated wastewater enter the American waterways just because of CSOs. So this is a typical problem that is quite systemic. We are facing across the developed world, and really has attracted discussion about what we can do about this. So let's see the situation in England. In England, we have 10,610 CSOs with a permit to discharge. They are connected, and this is something to remember also is important. Their pollution load depends on the works they're connected to. In other words, if a works has a lot of population and a lot of pollution that comes from people, that is the source, that is the load that will be discharged from CSOs when they operate. Of course, in theory, diluted because there is rainfall. So here you can see the extent of this network. With blue dots are sewage treatment works. With red dots are overflows. So you can see you probably live very close to either a works or an overflow. There are 5,186 sewage treatment works, and 10,610 were monitored last year. So we have data on them from last year out of the 14,000 that exist. So quite a high percentage of it we had data. The data is mainly in terms of the number of incidents, how often they open, and for how long they stay open. Okay. Now the problem is that out of those 10,600 CSOs, 9,346 spill. Right. So they are used. They are connected with 2,475 works out of the 5,000 ones. So that gives us an idea of the problem that is quite extensive. It's across the water companies. It's across the country. And what's fascinating about it is how long they stay open. So what you can see here on the right is the variation between the companies. But really, if you aggregate the time for how long they stay open, you can see, for example, that only 12% of them, of the ones monitored, do not spill, right? 33% have an aggregated time of up to a day. 27% between a day and a week aggregated, so over the year they will be spilling for a week. 17% of them between 1 week and a month. 10% between 1 month and 6 months. So a duration of it's not continuous, but if it was continuous, it would be 6 months, and 4.5% more than 6 months. Okay, so that's automatically that tells you that something is wrong. Right, they're supposed to be used not frequently, irregularly. We do not have rainfall for these periods, right? So it doesn't make sense to have this, at least some of them, running for that long. But again, you can see that most of them, that again, remember that this is not just enough information, because this is just duration. We do not know how big are the pipes. We do not know what is the real flow. We just know the incidence and the duration, right? So it's not really enough to tell us where is the impact. Now, our assumption, there is lots of reasons that this can happen. It can happen because we have more rainfall. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. It can happen because we have an aging infrastructure network and you have more infiltration. Well, that could account for some of it. But the real issue in what we found in our research is that it has to do with capacity. So remember what we said about the capacity of the wastewater treatment plants, right? They need to be 3 dry water flow, roughly. You can see here that out of those plants, so out of the 9,346 plants which were monitored at the spill, quite a lot of them, we had data in terms of the dry weather flow of the works they're connected to. Okay, so we were able to calculate that the works that were connected to the CSOs that spill, about 14 of them were actually had less than 1 dry weather flow, right? Which is problematic. 213 plants had 1 to 2 dry weather flow. 966 plants have less than dry weather flow, and only 482 had between 3 and 6, and 133 above 6, right? Now, what's interesting also, so this tells you that the ones really that are red do not have enough capacity to even carry their own dry weather flow, not the addition of rain when it rains. So in theory, they could be spilling even when it doesn't rain. Well, for the last 2 categories, in theory, you have enough capacity, although they do spill also. Now, the interesting thing about this is that dry weather flow is also an indicator of how big is the plant, right? Because the bigger the dry weather flow, the larger the flow it accepts, the more people it serves, right? So you can see here a trend that you see the mean that it goes from up. So over 6 dry weather flow are very small plants, 447 cubic meters per day, and you can see 3,000, 5,000, 26,000, 36,000. So the bigger the plants, the less capacity they have, right, to do this. That is understandable in some respects because they have more the ability to scale up, kind of to balance the flows, but still is an indication because we know that they also spill when they shouldn't. So for 668 works we didn't have data for because we couldn't do this work. They're actually small works. The reason we don't have the data is because they are small, although they are connected to 1,733 CSOs, to be accurate in terms of the numbers. Right. So what you see here is when you plot those maps, and when you see, for example, this is sewage treatment works that are connected to CSOs that spill. You can see, for example, that on the x-axis is how long they spill, right? And on the right axis, you can see what's their capacity. And you can see a clear trend that the ones that are below 3 dry weather flow, the greens and the reds kind of spill mainly with around 1 to 6 months. So they are the ones that spill more than the others. So which also indicates that it's a capacity problem. Similarly, for example, if you look at the ones that are 3 to 6 dry weather flow, so they have a bit more than 3, they actually peak at the spill much less than the other ones. So there are a lot of parameters that will influence this, but it gives you a good hint that capacity is really a problem. And it does make sense because if you think that most of these plants were designed and built years ago, right? How can they be serving the same population without when the capacity is not hasn't changed in most of them? We compare to 1990, 1987 to now, 10 million more people are in the UK, are in England, but this hasn't really seen the equivalent change in infrastructure. Now, this is the same exactly table, but with overflows. So you can see, for example, here, the overflows connected. It took us ages. Theo, who's done most of the work, has actually put the hours in connecting the overflows to the works, which is not there. It takes a lot of effort through maps to find this connection. And you can see here the distribution of works, also of overflows, really matching this idea of capacity of the works. So it's also a misconception that when we think that there is a problem with the overflows, it is the network's fault. It's probably more the sewage treatment works fault that doesn't have the capacity to receive the load. Okay, so what? I mean, all of this, somebody will say, the agency probably will say, so what? This is just hours of spillage. You don't know the volume. You don't know how small is the pipe. You don't know how much is the effluent that is discharged. You only know the incidence. How do we know that there's an impact, right? How do you know that somebody should worry about the combined sewer overflow next to their site spilling for 25 hours? It will depend on the volume of the water. So here we looked at the agency's classifications in terms of the WFT, the Water from Directive. So as before, we've seen that a good way to look at the impact of this is to evaluate how it affects the ecological status of the water body, right? We looked at for which water bodies the agency has already allocated the cause to combined sewage overflows as the reason for failing the good ecological status. And when you look at this, you find that there are 398 distinct water bodies that failed to achieve good status between 2013 and 16 and 2019. So this is, the agency has done the pressure assessment and has established that these water bodies are failing the good ecological status because of CSOs. And when you look into this, which is interesting, first of all, it tells me that 325 of those were connected to 2,700 CSOs that discharging those water bodies, are connected to 470 works, but 73 water bodies are connected to CSOs that are not monitored. So that gives you a bit of a hint that we're not monitoring everything, right? There is a concern out there if the companies are providing all the right evidence. So there are water bodies that might be important, but are not connected, but are not monitored. And this is the same thing. Okay, so what you see here is you see this subsection, this smaller group of the 380 waterworks that are discharging through overflows in areas that have failed the classification, that have failed, they have not met good ecological status because of the overflows. Okay, and you can see here that the fact that there are overflows, there are works with overflows that spill much more longer than the rest of the overflows in the country, justify the concern from the agency. You know, the fact that they are the reason we are not meeting good ecological status. Okay, again, remember, works might have 1, 2, 3, more than 10 sometimes overflows. It doesn't mean that they will all spill, right? It takes normally it goes to the first one, the second one. So as long as there is one out of those own overflows that spills, we take it into account, and that shows that actually those sites that fail the quality standards have an issue in terms of really an issue in terms of overflows. You can see that the combined sewage overflows are the cause for the failure. Now, let me explain. This is quite important. So I'll explain why three dry weather flow. You know, if you consider how the dry weather flow works, we said that a plant should be able to treat 3 dry weather flow. This let's say is 140 liters per day. If the plant was only treating 1 person's effluent, right? 140 liters per day. This doesn't arrive to the plant at the same time, right? It follows this distribution. So in the morning, you know, as people are waking up, they use less water. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, you have a peak of water use. It drops around lunchtime. So this pattern in terms of how they are receiving the water, right? If the water plant was only receiving just the effluent of let's say 140 liters, it will have to accept a dry weather flow of 5.8. Because if you multiply 5.8 by 24 hours, this gives you 140, right? So that doesn't happen. So that means that to account for the variation we get during the day, the plants should be allowing for more than 1 dry weather flow. So normally, if you had 1 dry weather flow, it means that your combined sewage overflows will leak for all these peaks above 1, right? If you go for 2 dry weather flow, there is still some, even with no rainfall, right? They will still have to open them because they don't have the capacity to treat. And only if you have 3 dry weather flow and above, there is some space at those peak times to cover some of the rainfall. Of course, for all the hours, the bigger the catchment, the more capacity you have to balance the demand and fill those gaps when you have extra capacity. But that's a problem with how treatment works operate, right? It has to do with when the flow comes and how do you balance this flow. So although there's a lot of other parameters, it gives you an idea of why we say that this capacity is an issue, because of the fact that you can see that at some point in most of the plants will not have the ability to treat any rain, and therefore will open the combined sewers overflows.
Nick, we're nearly at time.
I think I'm done. So I was going to say, do we really know if this is lack of investment? Well, I'm not sure. The evidence there, I just picked this quotes from some recent posts. You know, there is some concern that there has been some decline in investment in wastewater treatment plants, and therefore maybe that has to do with the capacity. Again, is a problem with any infrastructure that has been aging. But to conclude, you know, I think we need to go back into a system that we appreciate, that a robust and modern water infrastructure is part of a country, part of a society, which can develop, which can offer foster economic growth and ensure a high quality of living. The water companies, we should really appreciate them for what they have. They should be thinking of really forward and thinking about the role of investment in delivering long-term sustainability. They have a role to play as an important, as custodians, you know, of the water cycle when they do it correctly. And at the end of the day, they need to be able to manage the whole water cycle so that we avoid these issues in terms of sustainability and also not compromising the environment while keeping the water in the loop. The idea, for example, I really like the comment earlier that the drain has value, you know, water has value. The idea that putting in the ideal system, collecting it and treating it, you have more chances of using it. So the idea of water reuse is based on this extra water that's collected through your system. We should be thinking about not just how we let water escape, but how we collect it, treat it, and reuse it. And that's another concept we should look into when we're having these discussions. Okay, I rushed to put that all this in 15 minutes, but I hope you got the message. As I said, Theo has been very helpful in putting all this data between collecting the effluent, the discharges from the combined sewers overflows and the works, which is not readily available. And yeah, that's my contact if anyone wants to follow up this work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Brilliant, great there to see some real data on the issue as well. Now we're over to Bob Latimer online. Bob's been a long time campaigner against sewage discharge, so it would be fantastic to hear from him. So over to you, Bob.
Right, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for allowing me to speak, and it's encouraging to hear of such expertise. I'm just an old mechanical engineer, but I've first-hand experience in dealing with government authorities and complaining about sewage pollution. I can only offer what I've learned over 25 years of protesting about sewage discharges into the sea at Whitburn, and to warn you of the difficulties you have ahead of you. I don't think the Environment Agency is going to change, and there lies the problem. I live overlooking a sandy beach between the industrial rivers of the River Tyne and the River Wear. When I was a boy, like the other boys from the village, our enjoyment came from exploring the rock pools where the sea life was abundant. In 1996, there was a construction of what they called a stormwater system, consisting of a pumping station and a storage tunnel next to my premises. The tunnel is a mile long with a capacity of 14,000 cubic meters. We were told the system would only operate in extreme rainfall conditions and was to stop rainfall streams over the beach and would only operate about 20 times a year. After being commissioned in 1996, we noticed a smell of sewage and sewage debris on the shore. The total decline of the marine life in the rock pools, all of this was totally denied by the water company and the Environment Agency. This is almost a unique system whereby the CSOs flow into a storage tunnel, which has an operational capacity of 7,000 cubic meters. The permit stated that discharge to sea could only happen in extreme rainfall conditions. It was found that the system was operating outside of these conditions, and reluctantly the EA had to admit to this. This resulted in the water company having to apply for a new permit. A group of us managed to get a public inquiry, but we were disappointed to find that both the water company and the Environment Agency employed barristers to reduce the scope of the inquiry. The outcome was that although we were only lay people, the inspector accepted our argument and recommended explicit conditions on the permit. The conditions on the permit are unique in that, unlike other CSOs, they are regulated by volume, and a discharge cannot take place until it is as a result of rainfall or snowmelt. These conditions have never been met, and here lies the problem. After 10 years of beach pollution, typified by the council beach reports, such as the one on the 1st of August 2008, where they say too many items of sewage to estimate, yet the bathing waters passed the test. The council solution: cancel the beach inspection, so no reports. We managed to have a case brought before the European Court in 2012. This found against the UK because Whitburn was breaching the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. This is still going on, 10 years now with no improvement. Since then, I've had a number of questions in Parliament. I've had the Environment Information Regulations used to prevent access to information, and have 9 failed appeals to the Information Commissioner, numerous appeals to Ofwat and DEFRA, etc., etc. I no longer get a Christmas card from the Environment Agency, and there's no improvement achieved so far. My point is to warn everyone about how far you might have to go to achieve any reduction in sewage discharges. I have found ours is just a permit to pollute. It is unregulated, data is ignored or even falsified. The water company does not care about the environment damage, and the little man like me is vilified as manifestly unreasonable. If I had time, I'd like to give you some horrifying figures from our area to remind you that what is now being found in all waterways is only part of the problem. In 2009 alone, in 2019 alone, data reveals 760,000 tonnes of untreated sewage was discharged into the sea from Whitburn pumping station. And to make it even worse, last week the figures for 2021 showed 821,000 tonnes of untreated sewage was discharged, far in excess of the previous figures. Also, there in the River Tyne, there are 374 permitted CSOs. In the River Wear, there's 184 CSOs. Three untreated overflows discharged to sea from the Hendon treatment works. Working this out, it works out at 3 million tonnes bypassing treatment. All of these rivers are flowing into the sea in our bay. And I keep hearing about monitoring, which I've heard about today. And much faith is placed on more monitoring, but my experience is as follows. Whitburn Storm Water Pumping Station discharges are now counted as 12 and 24-hour system, counted in a 12 and 24-hour system. So this means any number of discharges in a day are counted as one, whether they are 20 minutes or 20 hours. Whitburn discharges at 1,500 litres a second. Yes, 1.5 tonnes a second. Such a counting method is designed to achieve guideline figure from the EU of 20 discharges a year. The 2020 figures supplied by NWL to the EA for all overflows of the untreated sewage from Sunderland treatment works were claimed to be 27, amounting to 15 hours. But later, when challenged by a member of the public, the EA had to admit the actual total discharges were 178, amounting to 646 hours, which by calculating known flow rates, this is 3 million tonnes. The information provided by the regulator cannot be trusted. It is the same with the bathing water tests. 20 tests only in the summer months. They comprise of a bottle of seawater taken from the shallows at a time, tide and location chosen by the Environment Agency. A sample can now take 24 hours before being analysed. It used to be 6. Poor results can be weather wavered, or in our case, then admitted and replaced by one on a different day. In 2018 and 19, there were no tests done when it was raining. I've now noticed a new comment on results which say potential to disregard. My experience is that the reliance on these tests to say that all is well, as the water company and the EA state constantly, is inexcusable. Regarding volume, even an amateur's estimation of the volumes shows a realistic exposure of what is actually happening. Stating flows in hours such as those in the River Trust's sewerage map minimises the reality to the members of the public. Flows need to show the litres, and in our case, the tonnes going into our waters. It is unfortunate for the regulator here that the permit does state the limit in volumes, which we can compare to data, which then proves what is really happening. My dealings with the EA as the regulator has been shocking. They show no concern that we've been telling them about what we've been seeing and experience, and providing data might be the truth. My own personal data reveals a fixation with keeping me quiet. No chance. Giving me no information and ignoring the very real problems of pollution here, never once has there been any effort to investigate the truth. Can we please try to ensure that there's a new and competent regulator? I'd like to finish by saying Whitburn has recently gone through the process of drawing up a neighbourhood plan and is at the stage of being assessed by the examiner. The local authority has suggested there should be 397 houses, additional houses allocated to Whitburn. My concern, as I'm sure you've guessed, is what is the sewerage going to go? What I've found is that with any development in this area, all that is needed is for the local authority to say to the water company, do you have capacity in your sewerage network? And of course, they always say yes. This has to be changed. Many of my colleagues have now passed away before there had been any improvement here, but I'm hanging on. I'd like to be optimistic that conferences such as this and the work being done by mostly voluntary groups and the public, the parliamentary concern will finally improve the situation. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bob, and thanks for sharing with all of us your experiences for your long campaign against sewerage. So it's great to hear those experiences. Next up, we have Helen Hamilton, who is an ecological and planning consultant at Marches Planning. So over to you, Helen.
Can everybody see my slides up there?
We can't see your slides just yet.
Okay, let me try again. They should be sharing them now. Are they not appearing?
No.
No. We tried this yesterday. Is Herman there? I think he's got copies if he can put them up for me. Let me just close and open the share tray again. No, is that, can you see me?
Yeah, we can see you and we can hear you.
Okay, you can see and hear me. I'd really like to play my slides if I can, but you're not seeing them.
No.
Oh, I might, unless.
Here we go.
Okay, excellent. Okay,
yeah,
brilliant.
Great.
Thank you. Is that Herman operating them for me? I think so. So I'll just say next slide when I need it. Yeah, sorry about that. Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking about nutrient management plans in rivers, but in particular the River Wye nutrient management plan, which is the one that I've been most involved with and know most about. The River Wye is a special area of conservation. Next slide, please. Nutrient management plans were devised for two purposes. The first of them was to manage the nutrients going into Natura 2000 water bodies. Those are water bodies, rivers designated under the Habitats Directives, and these are vulnerable to high levels of nutrients, in particular phosphates and nitrates, which cause eutrophication and ecological damage. So the idea of the plans was to control the nutrients that go into the watercourses to secure the Conservation and Water Framework Directive objectives. The next purpose was to provide mitigation for new development that would add additional nutrient into the watercourses, and in particular new residential development, because as we've been hearing about, the nutrients that come from the foul drainage via sewage treatment plants and also from private drainage as well. In reality, it was the second objective that was the main driver for the adoption of nutrient management plans, because planning authorities were finding that they couldn't provide a positive habitats regulations assessment for their new development plans, providing for additional housing without some means of mitigating against the nutrients that will be generated by that development. Next slide, please. So the nutrient management plans were one of a suite of measures drawn up under the site improvement plans for these sites, intended to secure, as I say, these conservation and water framework directive targets to achieve favourable ecological condition. But the reality is that they were most actively pursued because of the planning authorities that needed some way of mitigating the development that they were proposing. Next slide, please. So the River Wye Nutrient Management Plan in particular was created following an agreement between Natural England and the Environment Agency in 2014, and this enabled Herefordshire Council to adopt its new development plan, allowing for 16,500 new homes over the plan period. Even though at the time the plan was adopted, the River Lug, seen here, one of the tributaries of the Wye, was failing to achieve its conservation objectives. The failure was identified as excessive levels of phosphate pollution, although the supporting documents demonstrate that other nutrients, nitrates in particular, are posing a threat to the river, to the catchment as a whole, but in particular the Lug. Next slide, please. So there were two main measures very broadly, two main measures in the nutrient management plan, and the first of them was to address the sewage treatment works. Welsh Water, Dŵr Cymru is the local water utility, and they have their 5-year programme of upgrading their sewage treatment works and introducing phosphate stripping at those plants. The other strand of the plan was to address direct and diffuse pollution from agriculture, and this was carried out entirely through what's called catchment sensitive farming. So these are grant funded measures to, for example, put covers over slurry pits and concrete over farmyards and put in drainage so that manure and other pollutants don't get into the watercourses. These were all voluntary measures. Next slide, please. So the Nutrient Management Board has Nutrient Management Plan has a board which is charged with delivering the measures in the plan, and this is made up of several organisations, including the competent authorities, so the Environment Agency, Natural England, Natural Resources Wales, and the planning authorities that were making the decisions to grant these permissions. Dŵr Cymru is a member. The National Farmers Union and the Country Landowners Association were also members, and along with several other organisations most of which were involved in offering farming advice and distributing catchment sensitive farming grants. And one of the first problems that has been encountered with the nutrient management plan is that the NFU and the Country Landowners Association have had a very strong influence over the board. In fact, they were actually on the technical advisory group, which was drawing up the measures to go into the plan. And as a consequence, they resisted anything other than catchment sensitive farming voluntary measures going into that plan. Next slide, please. And the next problem is that there wasn't actually any means of monitoring whether the plan was working. In fact, after the plan was adopted, the Environment Agency reduced the number of monitoring points on the Wye from 48 to just 8. The EA's water testing was carried out every 3 months, and then results presented as the mean over 3-year periods. And so consequently wasn't able to capture any changes very quickly in what was going on in the river. And it's still the most recent catchment data on the Environment Agency's website is from 2019. So that reflects the mean data for 2017 to 2019. In addition, Natural England hasn't actually carried out any monitoring of the ecological condition of the Wye since 2010. Next slide, please. And there's also been an evolution in the understanding of how where the pollution is coming from. So when the plan was adopted, phosphate pollution was apportioned roughly 50-50 between the water industry and agriculture, with a small proportion attributed to other sources. By 2020, there was new modelling from the Environment Agency, which showed that agricultural pollution was actually a much bigger contributor, at that time about 66%. Of the phosphate pollution in the River Wye catchment. And at the same time, the improvement from sewage treatment plants were coming through. So the water industry share of the pollution was starting to reduce. And then last year, there's a team at Lancaster University called the Refocus team, which is looking into the Wye catchment. And it showed, it produced data that showed actually that agricultural pollution is responsible for about 3/4 of phosphate pollution going into the River Wye. Next slide, please. And this slide helps to explain why, I hope. It's actually a slide produced by Welsh Water. And I'm not clear whether it includes sewage outfalls, but it gives you an indication of what the problem is. The slide on the left-hand side shows where the pollution is coming from in the catchment if you only look at sewage treatment plants. And there's a few red blobs on there which shows where the sewage treatment plants are actually causing a problem. The slide on the right-hand side of the screen, or right-hand side of my screen, shows the other sources of pollution, which are almost exclusively agriculture. So all of those red blobs on the map show agricultural pollution in the Wye catchment. And so the message from Welsh Water was that they can upgrade every sewage treatment plant they have, but you're still going to have a very significant sewage problem, pollution problem in the River Wye and its catchment. Next slide, please. And there was further evidence coming out of the Refocus study, and this found that there is a massive legacy store of phosphate in the soils of the Wye catchment, equivalent to 3,000 tonnes every year. And this has accumulated through the excess application of manures and fertilisers, which have not then been taken up by the crops. So Refocus says that they, without measures to draw down this phosphate and stop applying more phosphate to the land, this legacy store is just going to keep on increasing. There's a particularly acute problem in the Wye because of the very large number of intensive poultry units. Poultry manure contains a higher proportion of phosphates than any other farm manure, and it's almost exclusively disposed of by spreading onto land. And again, if the nutrients are not taken up by crops, then they end up in the watercourses. Next slide, please. This map is produced by CPRA and CPRW, and it gives you an idea of the problem with poultry manure pollution in the catchment. Each one of those chickens on there represents the location of intensive poultry units. That's not one poultry unit each one. Some of those will have up to 16 poultry units on the site, although to be fair, most of them will be 2 to 4 units, and in Wales more commonly you'll find single poultry units. Next slide, please. The next thing that happened in 2018 was that the European Court issued the case in the Dutch nitrogen judgment, and this said that plans such as nutrient management plans couldn't be relied on as mitigation for new development that posed a risk to a Natura 2000 site unless that plan could be shown demonstrably to be working. And the nutrient management plan in Herefordshire in the Y catchment was not working, and so Herefordshire Council could no longer rely on it to grant planning permission for new development. Because the LUG was the worst effective, the council imposed an effective moratorium on development in the LUG catchment, which is still in place, as did several other planning authorities that were caught out by this judgment, in particular in the Solent and the Somerset levels. And in fact, the government wrote to, I think, about another 42 or 43 councils last week, warning them that they are also at risk under this judgment because of the risk of additional nutrients going into Natura 2000 catchments. Next slide, please. Yes, and then this happened in Herefordshire. Next slide, please. This is what happened in 2020. There were massive algal blooms along the length of the River Wye in Herefordshire, and these destroyed 95% of the water crowfoot. Water crowfoot is one of the reasons that the River Wye is designated an SAC. It's an aquatic plant that in turn provides habitat and food and spawning grounds for several other species, including other qualifying species. And so there were huge knock-on effects for the whole river ecology. It was described as an ecological catastrophe. The algal blooms appeared again last year. The ranunculus has not recovered, and the algal blooms will almost certainly appear again this summer. Next slide, please. Despite this, Natural England still doesn't accept that the River Wye is failing. As Natural England's view is that because the phosphate targets that it's set for the river are still being met, that the river is somehow okay. I say this is disputed by the hundreds of citizen scientists doing their own testing of the Wye, who say that phosphate levels are higher than the official recording is showing. But it is fair to say, and I think this was mentioned before, that there's no clear understanding of what the cause of the algal blooms are. We know that they're fueled by excess nutrients, but what balance of nutrients, we don't know. They will almost certainly have been exacerbated by low water levels in hot summers and high summer temperatures. Abstraction is quite a feature of the Wye. There's quite large quantities of water taken out, both for human consumption and for agriculture. And of course, climate change is probably playing a role as well. Next slide, please. So following the Dutch nitrogen judgment and this dreadful algal bloom, the nutrient management plan was revised last year, but it still doesn't contain any new measures to address agricultural pollution, even though it is now recognised that this is the main risk to the river catchment. So we're in a situation where the nutrient management plan is actually failing to deliver on either of its objectives. It's not helping to restore the river to good condition, and it can't be used as mitigation for new development either. Next slide, please. So in the hope of sounding slightly more optimistic, I would ask if there's a future for nutrient management plans. And I think that yes, there probably is. They provide a useful way of bringing the relevant organisations, the relevant data and the relevant measures together. But they have really got to have decisions that are based on much better information, on that actually prioritises the river and the need to restore it to good condition. And we also need stronger regulation, and crucially, we need enforcement of the regulation that we already have. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you ever so much, Helen. It's really good to hear a case study there from the Wye Valley and the details of that. Now it's over to Theo Thomas from the London Waterkeeper to tell us a little bit there about the problem of diffuse water pollution in the River Thames.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Good, right, okay, the weird hybrid. I knew this was a real world event because I managed to put the pin from my badge into my finger and I blared, so it wasn't virtual. Diffuse pollution sounds like it's quite confusing, and it is quite confusing. It's quite sort of obscure and hidden, I suppose. And I think that what essentially has happened is we've kind of increased the numbers of pollutants that we produce as a species, and at the same time exported them into the environment, as treat the environment as a sewage treatment works. And in the same way that we've kind of, while we see less industry in the UK, we've exported the impacts and the damage of that to the global south. So it's a global mindset, and it's also a very kind of local mindset as well. At the same time, we've kind of fractured the watersheds, the natural kind of systems that feed rivers, so that we've paved over so much of our areas, not just in places like London and other urban centres, but increasingly around the country. In London, over the last sort of 25 years, 22 times the size of Hyde Park has been paved over. So we've made the city a lot more kind of impervious. We've capped it, and so we sort of speed up the introduction of those pollutants into nature. And we used to kind of have a very different attitude to our kind of waste products. So when we had cesspits back in the kind of Middle Ages, that was a resource that was treasured, or urine was obviously treasured and used to tan leather. So that sort of sense of us being too closely connected to pollution, but also utilizing it, has kind of gone. And now we've sort of distanced ourselves from it. So with the illusion of kind of progress and the need to kind of wash away everything, whether that's through kind of, having multiple showers or flushing things away, we've just kind of given us the sense that we're incredibly advanced, and that kind of our technology allows all this stuff to be disposed of really quickly. And you almost kind of see that in the use of our technology in terms of electronics. It's all marketed to us in a very slick and very shiny way, whether that's our mobile phones or our computers, whatever it might be. But of course, there's a very dirty aspect to that, whether that's the power that's used to produce them, or the actual chemicals and minerals where they come from, and then being discharged, as I say, into countries perhaps far from here. Diffuse pollution in a kind of a traditional sense, if you like, is stuff that's going to get washed off roads or off industrial estates, or off people's backyards, whatever that might be. And there's been a kind of weakening of regulations. So in 2016 in England, it used to be that every hazardous waste producer had to be registered, and it was a little form that had to be filled in, and I think it cost £25. And a failure to do that would see you fined thousands of pounds and potentially end up in prison. At the start of April in 2016, that regulation was scrapped, but just in England. So if you don't have a hazardous waste registration in Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales, then you could end up in prison. So what happens now is that hazardous waste only appears on the records when it's collected for safe sort of disposal. But of course, there's a lack of oversight there because we have less of an idea where it is that this hazardous waste is being produced. And of course, the Environment Agency tells us that one of the biggest polluters of our rivers is waste processing or recycling plants, which are popping up. And they are, they're not the kind of in place. There isn't really enforcement and the sort of stringent application of regulations. So we kind of loosened our ability to quantify the problem as well. And then we have, things like, if people have dogs which gets fleas and then that's treated and that dog then splashes around in a river, then that's going to wipe out quite a large number of the insects that live there. Similarly, if people have kids and they apply head lice insecticide and that's disposed of incorrectly, that'll wipe out thousands of insects in a particular river. So the kind of diffuse pollution is incredibly diffuse and quite confusing. And then of course there's the stuff that comes off sort of places where cars park or vehicles park and the roads that the vehicles use as well. Things that have been touched on in terms of obviously heavy metals coming off brake pads, and the oils and stuff like that come out of the cars. But even with the introduction of electric vehicles, there'll be still stuff coming off brake pads and in particular what comes off tires. It's a big source of microplastic pollution, one of the biggest sources in the world. Obviously the kind of road markings and stuff like that, that's made of plastic, that gets washed off too. I've seen there's a move to recycle waste plastic by kind of melting it down and using that to fill potholes in roads, but I'm not sure whether there's been any investigation into whether that's going to get worn and then just end up into the environment. So at best, that's just a delay mechanism, I suppose. So yeah, that's a big problem. The microplastics of tires. It's very little tire is rubber. Most of it is kind of solidified plastics, and it's only recently that it's become understood that it's not just a problem in terms of the plastics, but the chemicals that are coming off vehicles. It took 20 years for scientists to work out why it was there were big salmon fish kills in rivers in the northwestern United States, particularly sort of Washington State and Oregon. And they worked out eventually that there's a preservative added to tires which makes them more resistant to being oxidized by ozone. So obviously pollution from cars creates sort of levels of ozone because it's quite a heavy gas. It's going to be quite low down, so therefore going to collect around tires, and that makes tires brittle, obviously reduces their longevity, so increases the risk of them failing, but also them being replaced. So they add this chemical, and that stops the tires breaking down, but it reacts with the ozone and produces something that's incredibly toxic to salmon. And recently, just a couple of weeks ago, they discovered it also kills lots of trout as well. They don't know about its effect on other fish, but presumably it's not doing them any good. Presumably it's not doing us any good. And there's more and more use of astroturf, and a lot of that has a kind of a crumbled tire crumb underneath it. So when that's getting rained on, that presumably is getting released to rivers as well. And also we're breathing it in. So we're doing really well at increasing the number of pollutants. And then you add to that the forever chemicals coming off, things like non-stick pans, and pharmaceuticals. And so while you might have a sewage works that is not overflowing, particularly say during dry weather, what still might be coming out of that pipe is going to be a whole range of chemicals which we're not treating. And while, as has been referred to earlier, we maybe have a sense of the damage individually, although increasingly it's only very recently that we're understanding some of them. No one knew. The tire manufacturers said, well, we had no idea that quinone 9 or whatever might be killed fish. Would be worrying if they had known and still went ahead with it. But some of these products are really new. But what we don't understand is their combined effect on each other and that kind of bioaccumulation and how long that's going to last. And I think that one of those problems is that as I say, it's a cultural one. So you can go to lots of places where you'll have the stuff getting washed off the street that'll be going down to a series of drains and then eventually ending up in the river. But that could be a couple of miles, several kilometers away from where the river actually appears, because it's underground for most of that time. So that hides away the effect. It makes it look, you know, like we're having less impact, but actually it's just intensifying that. And, you know, in London, probably, you know, this is on the estimation of the Environment Agency as well, but every river fails water quality standards, probably on the kind of runoff from paved surfaces alone. And we know that it's only 14% around the country that actually pass water quality standards. So this is, you know, the kind of the runoff that we get from whether that's industrial estates or kind of roads and other parking areas is probably industrial in its quantity, but it's unquantified and mainly unregulated. People touched on the fact that there are probably laws that could be used to address it. Different governments of different hues from about 2007 have obviously understood that it's been a big problem. DEFRA used to have, the government, you know, Environment Department used to have a team that looked at diffuse pollution. That was scrapped a couple of years ago, and all the people that worked for that, you know, pretty much kind of been moved to other departments. From 2007 onwards, I think there's been about 4 consultations where the governments have kind of said, well, this is important, we need to look at this, and nothing's happened as a result of it. So I think that, you know, fundamentally because we've sort of exported the costs to the environment and it's all hidden away, fundamentally it's only going to change through grassroots action. And there are people who, you know, sort of, well, I talk to people who say live up in kind of northwest Brent in Harrow, and the Wilston Brook passes through a series of parks. But much of its kind of, most of its headwaters are underground, and yet actually, you know, that is the, you know, every street, every roof is the beginning of the Wilston Brook, which flows through the Brent and then of course into the Thames. So those people, they see firsthand the impact, not just of sewer overflows, but every time it rains, of the kind of the grey, silty sludge that gets washed into the river. And the longer the dry period and then a time of rain, the bigger that environmental impact. And these are small rivers that, particularly in the summertime, you know, are only going to be sort of, you know, just a few inches, just maybe 25, 30 centimeters deep. So that amount of pollution coming in one go is a serious pollution event, but it gets washed away. So of course, by the time anybody would turn up to try and investigate it, it's moved downstream. And one of the main parameters for whether or not it is a serious pollution event is whether any fish have died. Well, the fish in these rivers died long ago, so there are no more fish to die. It's simply an extension of the wastewater treatment system. So if we can kind of mobilize local people, and that's why the support of the Environmental Law Foundation is essential, and the people and the barristers and lawyers that support that, because that information that those people can get to help pursue and to put pressure on the authorities and regulators validates the fact that they know that this pollution is unwarranted and unjustified. And up until then, the power dynamic is very much in favour of those that have no interest in regulating it or reducing it. Of course, there are some good people within those institutions, but sadly, the culture has to change first to give them more power within it, but also to actually increase the voice that those local people have who are speaking up for their river. Thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much, Theo. That was excellent description of all the different causes of diffuse pollution. So now it's over to Claire Hunt from Imperial Centre for Environmental Policy, talking about misconnections. Fantastic. Just to confirm, we can see the slides online. That's great.
For 15 years on behalf of Yorkshire Water to begin with, doing some work for DEFRA on urban diffuse pollution later, currently worried about microplastics. And for much of this time, I've co-convened the integrated water management option of the MSc Environmental Technology. So my heart resides in sewage. Right, I can do it myself. Lovely. This was a picture I took in Epping Forest a couple of weeks ago. A surface stream clearly polluted with runoff from, well, a sink, washing machine, we don't know, but it's evidence of a misconnection. Many of you may know what misconnections are, some of you may not, but truly you will after 10 minutes of this talk. Okay. So what am I going to talk about? Misconnections, what are they, for anyone who doesn't know? How common are they? Does it matter? How you can check yours. This is an important bit. This is the citizen science bit and the way forward, because it can be cured. Very briefly, sewage history. Romans, public lavatories, they routed their rivers through the public lavatories to clean it, and it all went back to the river. 1800 years later, flush lavatories, they all mean lots more water is going into the Thames, so come on in the Thames, it gets quite disgusting, and we get Joseph Bazalgette to create sewers which we're still using 150 years later. They beat us to it in Paris, that's a bit of geography. The rest of Europe really required the EU legislation to get it up to scratch. Biology, you know what's in sewage, poo, and lots of other chemicals as well, everything that you put down your kitchen sink and fats. And maths, there'll be a bit more maths later, but we're on misconnections. So about 1 in 10 houses in the London Borough of Enfield, for instance, is reputed to be misconnected. So it's not a trivial problem. This is what it ought to look like. Okay, your toilet, your kitchen sink, your showers, they ought all to be routed to a foul water sewer. That's the red one in the picture. And they go to the sewage treatment works. Dealt with, lovely. If you've got water coming off your yard, your garden, if you've got highways water, rainwater, if you've got rainwater coming off your roof, it should go into a surface water sewer. And these go possibly directly to the river. So this is fine. This is where you have a separate system. As we know, a lot of London has a combined sewer system. So this is the situation where there is a separate system, and misconnections are what happens where, because somebody's done a bit of DIY, or maybe there was a cowboy builder, or maybe, you know, you just don't know that there is a two system sewer going. So you install a washing machine, you do a bit of work, and you connect your water to the nearest sewer. And if it's your new washing machine and it's going into the surface water sewer, that's not a good thing. And it ends up with the sewage going into the river. If it's the foul water sewer receiving your rainwater, that's not really quite so bad, you would argue, but it's all extra money, so it costs a bit more. This is the maths. Actually, how common are they? DEFRA estimate somewhere between 0.6% and 2% of households, which doesn't sound much, but it's 150,000 to 500,000 households with misconnections. London Borough of Enfield, which I said before, about 1 in 10, because it tends to be a newer area and they've got far more separate systems. Around half the properties in the country are separate systems, so this is somewhere where the problem can happen. It's especially common where there are extensions, where there's been modification, because the work doesn't get done by people who necessarily know about the systems. And it's going to be a greater problem the more new developments we have. So it's only going to get bigger if we don't do something about it. Does it matter? Yeah, it's disgusting. Sewage straight into the river, not a good thing. And even the extra cost of putting clean water to the sewage treatment works isn't a good thing. This is from Connect Right, who are a body who are an amalgam of people who are interested in getting proper connections. They're the Environment Agency, they're the water companies, they're a collection of plumbers. They have a list of about 5,000 plumbers who really know their stuff and can tell the difference. In comparison, there are 80,000 who may or may not, who aren't members. So DEFRA did a survey of how effective various different measures to address diffuse pollution were going to be. And you can see that top right, up there, green is the cheap, easy and effective, and bottom left is the expensive, difficult and ineffective, or at least not beneficial. And misconnections are number 2. They're halfway along on the right. So they're relatively cheap and they're quite effective, so it is worth looking at. Now, what can you do about it? This is where we do some DIY. This is where you turn into a citizen scientist and you have a look at your own property. If you've got a property that's after 1920, possibly not after 1950, you've got a lot more chance of having a separate system. So go and have a look at the age of your property. Look at the manholes outside. Have you got 2 lots of manholes? If you've got only 1 manhole, then lift up the lid and see if you've got 2 systems inside, one higher than the other, because that means you've got a foul water system above and a surface water system above and a foul water system below. Run some water. You can run some garden hose down the rainwater, and you can flush the toilet to find out where the foul water is going. You can buy traceable dye from the builders, and as it says, you can check where it's going. Shove some red dye into your foul water and possibly some green dye into your clean water and see where they turn up within the system if you've got a separate system. Now, the next slide probably needs to come with a public health warning. If you are of a sensitive disposition, look away now. This was what I was doing on Sunday, 2 days ago. That's my downstairs lavatory. I poured a tablespoon of green food dye, so we hope it's not dangerous for the environment, because it's not supposed to be dangerous for us, into my lavatory pan. I got my glamorous assistant, that's what he insists on being called, to flush the loo, and I'd gone outside and taken off the manhole cover, and there is my green flush water flowing away. It's a bit of a cheat in my case. I know that I've got a 1905 property, so I've only got a combined system, but I do have 3 houses further up the road that go directly into my stuff, and I've got several pipes that go into it, but it's easy to do. It only takes a few minutes. Most people have got some food dye, or you can get it from the grocers. It's not quite as threatening as going to a builder's merchants. So I challenge you, have a go. It is worthwhile. More citizen science. If you want to do it on a bigger scale, again, there are ways of tackling it on a larger scale. We've already established that what really matters here in terms of polluting the environment is surface water outfalls, which are flowing into the rivers and exterior water, but which actually are containing sewage. So an outfall safari is something that has been developed by the Zoological Society of London and the Rivers Trusts. And they organise outfall safaris whereby at decent weather, you're not doing it when it's raining, you get volunteers who've got an appropriate app to walk along the river, identify the surface water outfalls on the river, check on what they're like, what they're doing. They can geolocate, photograph and assess on various scales that given them whether this is an outfall which is likely to be polluted. And the most polluted ones get dealt with quickly, but these are directly reported to the regulator and the water company, and that something happens to them. It does work. It's worth joining. A few years ago, I held a workshop on urban diffuse water pollution, and the people there came up with a few ideas that were simple to execute, that would work and long term would cure the problem of misconnections. There are 3 of them here, quite simple ones. They're not law, but if we'd made it law, or if we just made it custom and habit and what actually happened, it would all work. So colour code all the drainage systems, blue for surface water and red for foul, so people would know what they were attaching their systems to, and they wouldn't accidentally attach it to the wrong one. Now, long-term issue, remove misconnections by legal action by the simple expedient of making it a matter of law that in order to sell your house, it had to have no misconnections. So the property survey is supposed to, would then identify whether there are any misconnections. It would mean the surveyors would have to know what was going on, but come on, it's a once in every sale time and it will work. And so it requires rectification then at the point of sale. It will cure the problem long term. And the final one was deculverting. It's opening up to the open air, sort of brooks that are currently covered over. People care about their local water. If they can see the water, if they know it's got foul stuff going into, then they can do something about it. Whereas if it's culverted, if it's covered over, nobody knows what's going on and we don't care. So if you deculvert it, you get cleaner water, you get better amenities, you get people who are enjoying some water around them because they always enjoy water around them, good ecology areas, win, win, win. These are the links. I'm sure that we'll distribute these slides afterwards. So these are the links, the people who I've mentioned, and basically the end of misconnections, we hope.
Thank you, Claire, there for leaving us on a positive note and some actions that we can all take there as well. Great, so we have some time now for some questions, about 15-20 minutes. We had one early on online from Guy Linley Adams, and I think it was a question for Helen, and the question was, why did the NFU and the CLA have such a dominant influence on the nutrient management plan, and who let them have such an influence? So that was a question very early on, so I thought it would be good to raise that quickly now.
I think the only way that I can explain it is that when the Nutrient Management Board was set up, there was an administration at Herefordshire Council that was very much dominated by farmers, and the chair of the Nutrient Management Board was a farmer. And I think the Nutrient Management Plan, as it was set up, didn't have very clear measures or a very clear understanding of what the problem was. So there was a belief, I think, that the farmers could deliver the aims of the nutrient management plan through voluntary measures. And so these organisations were allowed onto the technical advisory group. Other than that, it was not my decision. I wasn't involved, so I can't really explain.
Great. I hope that answers the question, Guy, and thanks for that, Helen.
Yeah, thank you.
And then there was another question online for Nick from Joe Bradley, and they ask, I'd like to ask Nick if he knows how often the permits for the sewer overflows are reviewed, and if the permits are adjusted when the number of houses and the extent of the development in the catchment has increased since the pass forward flow settings were agreed. So if a permit was issued 30 years ago and many houses have been built since, then surely the permit is no longer fit for purpose and should be reviewed. And if the agency are not reviewing these permits, should we insist that they do so? So that was a question specifically for Nick, but I suppose others may also have some comments on that as well.
The only evidence we have is when you look at the data, you get the data of the latest permit that when issued and some historical ones. You can see that they are not done, obviously, whenever you have a new development, a new housing development. So they can be 5, 10 years, or but definitely not 30. There have been renewals for some sites, just because the sites might be upgraded or because there is a significant change in demand. But it's not as frequent as, obviously, when you have new developments.
Okay, and that ties into some of the comments that were being made in the first session this morning as well. So I hope that answers the question, Joe. I actually thought I would just...
Can I just say, Alex, just one second, there's a positive change also. So it's not just we have more developments. People now are using less water than they used to, believe it or not, in terms of household. So for example, you know, if you see the capacity of a works in terms of population, if you also use less water, that also helps with the capacity, right? Because the whole dry weather flow is based on how much water we use individually and the population. The same thing with industry. A lot of industry has left since these plants were built. So there is less. So it's a more complex story, but you get the message in terms of overall capacity.
Thanks, Nick. I just had my own personal question, if I can use my kind of chair's prerogative. A number of speakers, Bob, Helen, Theo, you all spoke about problems with the regulator. And so I'd be interested to know how much you think that this is simply a case of the regulator being underfunded or under-resourced, or are there wider problems with the regulator? And if so, you know, how hopeful are you for the OEP, for the Office of Environmental Protection that's going to be established? How hopeful are you that that can help resolve some of those issues?
Shall I speak? Helen, I'm Helen.
Yeah, please do.
There does appear to be a lack of political will. There certainly has been. There is now additional funding going into the Environment Agency. It's yet to see how that's played out on the ground. But we've got the serious problem with Natural England failing to even recognise the extent of the problem in the Wye catchment. I would hope that the Office for Environmental Protection, you know, would take a look at this and say it's frankly ridiculous to look at a river in the condition that it's in and say that, you know, we don't need to be doing more about it than we are. But frankly, at the moment, there is not a lot going on and there is very little time left to save it. So I hope that something's going to change. At the moment, I'm not seeing any evidence of it.
Thanks.
Bob Latimer, can I say something?
Yeah, sure. Please do. Please come in.
I was an engineer with my own business and worked in the Nissan car plant for 32 years, the most productive car plant in the UK, in Europe, and possibly the world. I maintained the machines, installed the machines and maintained the machines that made the cars. Now, we did that work, and at the end of that work, they had engineers, they had overseers that came and inspected the work. So everything was, you know, above board and it got checked over, and it didn't, until I got the pass, I didn't get paid. That's unlike the relationship with the Environment Agency and the water company, is that the water company can just dictate what they want to do and the public are paying. And it's like me, I'm paying for to have my sewage treated. But when I look at what's being dished out of the storm system, you know, it's just bad value for money. But at the end of the day, I don't believe it's funding with the Environment Agency. I believe that they're not up to the job.
Well, I mean, there's some truth in the need for, I guess, but put controls in how you measure performance. But to be honest, also this is a very heavily regulated industry, right? So I think a lot of the pressure has been on keeping the bills down. So putting a lot of pressure in not increasing how much we pay, rather than the investment that is required. So in some respect, we have to see the need for actually some of our bills increasing because we need such an investment in infrastructure. I mean, that's kind of how I see it. It's a very heavily regulated industry, so OFCAT plays a role in actually keeping, I think the most, in my view, the greatest priority for them is to keep the bills low, and that hasn't helped in putting the investment in this sector.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for those replies. And I think we have questions from the room. So perhaps if we take a few now, because we've had a few from online.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam Meach, Imperial College. I have a question which is probably primarily maybe for Helen and Nick, but also maybe if others want to comment. I think interesting part of the presentations, I think this morning, and especially Helen, when she was saying that the measures that were implemented as part of the nutrient program actually didn't work, which is quite devastating, honestly. So maybe if you can discuss a bit, the question is, what was the evidence that was used to allocate those measures? How it was decided where and how the measures will be implemented, because it's a quite big system that you are looking at. So I'm wondering, is there a question of scale and targeting areas which are really struggling with or creating the biggest impact? And then maybe more generally, maybe question around the evidence around the policy regulation and then measures that are used to manage the system. Thank you.
Okay, shall I answer that? Can you hear me? Sorry. So there were a series of documents that were drawn up to provide the basis for the nutrient management plan, and one in particular that set out how various different things should be achieved. It was actually quite a long and detailed document, and it hasn't really properly been followed. I think that a big part of the problem was that there was such a range of things, right from, one of the proposed measures was to reclassify poultry manure as waste, and that simply never happened. Nobody looked at it. And so the plan sort of homed in on, these one or two measures, as I say, catchment sensitive farming, and the upgrading of the sewage treatment works. I think my honest view is that the nutrient management plan was rather seen as a nice thing to have, because it enabled planning authorities to provide habitats regulations assessment for their development, and then it was sort of put on the back burner. There were a lot of organisations and the Wildlife Trust doing some good work, which was meant to feed in to the nutrient management plan, but it really was never coordinated. Some of the measures that were in the documents drawn up at the time that the plan was adopted were never even looked at. And then, as I say, as time went on, the evidence of the apportionment of the pollution became more and more clear. And just in the last year, the refocus evidence about the legacy phosphate in the catchment has become clear. And there are as yet no new measures at all to address that. So there's a sort of been a lag in understanding, but also there was, until the Dutch nitrogen judgment, there was actually no incentive to really implement the plan at all.
Right, thanks ever so much, Helen. And do we have any other questions then from the room? Because we've taken a couple from online, so.
Hi, thank you so much for the talks. They've been really educational and very informative. There's been a lot of talk about how highly regulated this is as an area, but also a lot of talk about targets being missed and a lack of effective enforcement action. Do you think to some extent the level of regulation and new regulation and incentives is a bit of a distraction, and maybe it's something that might be able to be waved around by politicians, but if there is no enforcement action, is the increased regulation in this area really helping in any way?
Oh, and I guess that
one in particular, but
yeah, I guess that's to all of the speakers.
Well, I maybe I just offer an answer. I think the first step is to solve the problem is recognizing that you have one. And I think that's partly what's happening now. It's not so much the regulation in terms of forcing anyone. I believe that for years now, the water companies didn't even know where the overflows were and how often they were operating. Right now, the data that is collected to demonstrate how often they're used, what the impact they're having, and that, as a result, will be a driver for investment, for things to change, for stopping these discharges. They were not as frequent as the problem will get worse, and it has been worsening because of more rainfall, because of climate change. As we understand, the capacity is being reduced as more people. So historically, this is a problem that is getting worse and worse. So I think legislations are there to help us understand that something is going wrong and change it. And I think probably that's is where we are now.
Can I? Yes, I've got a comment on that as well, which is, an example being the farming rules for water, the diffuse agricultural pollution regulations, which came in 2018, and I believe I'm correct in saying that there hasn't been a single prosecution under those regulations, and also it's quite clear that most farmers don't even know that they exist. Yes, the regulations are nice things to wave around, but I go back to what I said at the end of my talk. They need to be enforced, and actually there are weaknesses in the regulations as well, but but to enforce the regulations we already have, and that includes the nitrate vulnerable zone regulations, might be a good start.
Hi, thank you very much to all of the speakers. I think my question might be best directed at Nick, but happy to hear from anyone. So we know that the EA and Ofwat are back in November, announced that they'll be launching an investigation into, I think it's the 2,000 worst CSOs, based on, I guess it's kind of the public awareness of the issue of CSOs. But perhaps at what point should they have been aware that there was a problem? What point might they have been, should they have started investigation of that nature?
Well, in theory, they captured quite a lot of this problem with the classifications of the WFD. So we know that the agency clearly states that all these water bodies are failing their quality status because of CSOs. So that's the start. That's about a big number of CSOs. So that should be enough to be putting pressure to water companies to improve their performance of those sites. Again, if you look at how the Water Framework Directive implementation works, it's a very slow process. So there's lots of other contributing factors that we haven't been doing that well in improving the quality of our waters anyway across all the pressures. So I guess that's where we are. The risk is that sometimes we forget that this is not just about the network; it's about the works. And we might be thinking about storing, even the London tunnel. What it does, it would be storing the water, right? But what will happen to it afterwards? I mean, storage offers some treatment, but it will still have to go through the works. Right? I mean, that's what we're trying to say, that we need to think about treating and about properly treating our effluents before they reach the environment, not just finding ways that might avoid some of the symptoms, but not the real causes of the issues.
Great, thanks, Nick. And we've got a couple of hands up online, so we'll just take those before we break for lunch. But yeah, if I ask Mike Owens, who's been waiting very patiently. Thank you for that, to ask his question.
Good day all. Yeah, I've just got an observation really. And water companies around where I live, that's Southern Water, they're making quite a big deal out of keeping rainwater out of their system by attenuation methods, drains and suds and that sort of stuff. But the reality is the amount of rainfall that comes completely overwhelms that saving by just going into the sewage network and causing sewage overflows. And that's a real big problem because suds, with the built environment as is today, that built environment isn't going to change tomorrow. And so the same level of stormwater discharge is going to happen. And you can't retrofit this stuff most of the time. It's much easier to do it on new developments. So the reality is that the toxicity in terms of chemical and fecal pollution going into our seas and waters is actually increased as a result of suds, because there's more sewage going in than there was before and less rainwater. So the actual percentage of toxins is actually increased.
I think that's a good point. And also, there is a school of thought that says that maybe we should be collecting all the rainfall so that we clean it and reusing it. And in the future, you might see that this might really be an alternative source of water. So instead of separating it and leaving it to suds, I mean, there's lots of benefits about flooding and suds, but we should also think about the future when we do not have enough water and there is a need to clean that water and reuse it. So in theory, the amount of water we take from nature plus the rainfall is what we should be targeting to clean before putting it into the environment or before reusing it.
I agree, but Southern Water is actually concentrating on methods of keeping them out of the limelight, out of the headlines. That's the point. I think regulation needs to make sure that they do something about it.
Right, and then we have a final question online from John Davidson, who waiting very patiently. Thank you there, John. Oh, John, you're on mute.
Can you all hear me?
Yep, that's great. We can hear you now.
My question is this. Clearly, the water companies are fiddling their figures so that they can make possibly excess profits or just get away with stuff. My question to the meeting is this. What evidence do we need to rebut these water companies' figures? Because it seems to me in some cases, and they'd have to be very carefully chosen, that fishermen or other people with an interest in the water could put in a private prosecution. I was an ex-prosecutor, and it is possible to institute private prosecutions in the case of where water companies have just been really naughty, shall we say. The Director of Public Prosecutions, of course, has the power to take over a private prosecution, but I think in a case like this, it would certainly cause a heck of a lot of publicity, not necessarily of a bad kind. I'm just a retired solicitor and a keen fisherman, and obviously if people put stuff down the river that kills the fish, we'll sue them. We all know what the common law is. But when water companies are just emptying sewage into the river, not killing the fish, what happens? It happens near us in Ilkley that people want to swim in the river and they're getting sick. What happens if someone dies? Do we have a manslaughter prosecution? I just leave those points to you, but I will be very interested to hear what evidence private people can put to bring prosecutions against water companies. Thank you.
This is a good point. Can I say this is a good point? Because remember, all the data we discussed are provided by the water companies. They're not done by the regulators. But this is not uncommon, right? When you have a new chemical in the market, all the data is not provided by the agencies. They're provided by the companies that produce them. So this is a typical case in terms of who does the work in proving that something is safe. Our trust in their data has to be validate it, and that's where the regulators comes. But it's not uncommon that they are the ones providing the data. Obviously, we need mechanisms to ensure that the data are valid and they're not leaving out. For example, in the West cases, we saw that 70 water bodies were down, not failing consent because of CSOs, but no CSOs were identified. Data were provided by the companies. So that indicates to us that there is some gap in terms of the data that are provided.
We've simply got to make sure the data is right.
I think that's we've ended there on a really crucial point around the weight of evidence needed to kind of hold people to account and to bring prosecution. So thank you for that last point, John. I think that's a really salient point. And I think it also demonstrates why bringing together this grouping of people with the Environmental Law Foundation, academics, concerned citizens could be a really powerful force to bring all those heads together to think about that crucial issue. So thank you everyone for the contributions to this morning's session. We've now got lunch till just before, just 2, I think we'll be back, joining either online or virtually. And I think if you're in person, then lunch is available in SAUC 7. And I'm sure people there will be able to direct you. So thanks again to all the presenters and to all the contributions. Thank you ever so much.
Test. 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 Okay. Oh, I think Jen muted it. Test, test.
Yeah, there
okay.
you go.
Okay. Okay.
So that mic works.
Yeah, you just have to